That is the one prayer that we know.
Good evening. It's good to have each of you here. I'm going to state my goal tonight, and we're going to stick with it tonight. My goal tonight is to finish up a few thoughts in the 7th chapter of Daniel and cover the 8th chapter of Daniel. And I think we can do that because these two chapters are very similar in their meaning, and they cover a very similar period of time. And so that's my goal. Last week, we started in the 7th chapter of Daniel and spent quite a bit of time looking at the first half of that chapter. Just a couple of things I want to just remember. In the 7th chapter, Daniel is having some night dreams or night visions. And they are very troubling visions that he's having. He sees the seas are all churning and these 4 terrible beasts come up out of the seas. One's like a lion with the wings of an eagle. One's like a bear raised up on the side eating 3 ribs. And one's like a leopard with wings that's running and all of these are vicious and devouring animals. And the third one's not compared to an animal, it's just called a great and terrible beast comes up out of the sea. And it doesn't devour, it tramples and destroys. And it even raises itself up to where it tries to supplant God is the idea with this third beast or 4th beast. And so we see all of this. To me, we see turmoil amongst society or amongst mankind. And in the middle of all that turmoil, or in the midst of that, we have these 2 wonderful ideas presented that we looked at in verses 9 through 13. The first of the ideas is we've got all of these terrible beasts, which we understand are kings or governments. They're controlling the world. And then we have this beautiful picture of a throne in heaven and the majestic one sitting down on the throne, opening up the books and passing judgment on the ungodly governments of the world. And he passes judgment in favor of the saints or the children of God. And then not only does he pass judgment, he sets the Son of Man on the throne and he establishes his eternal kingdom. So, without looking at all the details we didn't look at all the details, but you can sit and speculate and look at a lot of details in that first part of that chapter. But he gives us the answer to what the message is down here in verses 15 through 18 of the chapter. We covered that last week, but I do want to read this again. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed within me, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. I think that's the way we feel many times when we look out amongst ourselves in the world and we see those that are in charge and what they're doing. When you think of Ukraine right now, if you were a Christian living in Ukraine, how would you feel? You'd feel like that great and terrible beast was trampling your life, right? Because it is. And we know some people in Moldova. Ernestine and I went to Moldova a few years ago. And maybe I shouldn't read the news, but one of the reports is that's their next target, is Moldova, if they are successful in Ukraine. So it seems that this evil wants to creep all around Eastern Europe and take dominion there, like a beast. And so I think this is what he's been talking about. Governments, once they want to take control of other people's governments, they become vicious beasts that try to trample and suppress everything around them. And those living and seeing that are like Daniel, they are really concerned, they're upset, and they're distressed. But God says, I'm sitting on my throne and my Son is ruling. And so that is a piece of confidence. That doesn't mean that the people who are being crushed by these different groups are not suffering, but it means that God is ultimately in control. And I think that's, to me, that's a purpose of the rest of the book of Daniel, is that God is ultimately in control. Of course, we know that was the purpose of the first 6 chapters too. God is in control. I think that's one of the main ideas of the book of Daniel. God is in control. And those who are in his kingdom will be successful. They're the ones that are going to be elevated. When it comes to the judgment seat, they're the ones that are going, when God opens his book, they're the ones that are going to be protected. Now, in verses 19 through the end of chapter 7, I didn't make many comments about that last week, but there's a couple of things I do want to point out in that section there. It will go to the end of the Daniel has a particular interest in the 4th beast because it was described as terrible and has these 10 horns, and then it has this one horn that comes up amongst them and plucks out 3 of the horns. And that horn becomes one who was a mouth uttering great boast or perverse things, and this beast seems to be different than the other beasts. Is exceedingly dreadful. He crushed and trampled down with his feet the 10 horns on his head, and the other horn which came up, this is verse 20, and before 3 of those fell, namely that horn had eyes and a mouth uttering great boast, and which was larger in appearance than associates. And I kept looking, and the horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the Holy One. And the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. So Daniel, in the interpretation, Daniel seems to understand the idea of the message is, yes, there's going to be this horrible persecution, but the God's kingdom is going to come out of that. That makes me think back to 2 things in the Old Testament. When the children of Israel came out of Egypt, was it a peaceful time for the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt? No, it was a very distressful time. The people of God were in Egypt. They were in slavery. They were being persecuted, and God delivered them. Did any of them die? I think there were a lot of babies that died. Moses was saved, and we think about that. But how many babies died when Moses, at the time Moses was saved? And so it was a very difficult and distressful time, but God saved them out of that distress. And I think that's the picture here. God's kingdom is going to be born into this world. It's going to be it's going to be a time when the kingdoms are oppressing, but God is going to save his kingdom out of the oppression. Those are in his kingdom. And that seems to be the idea that he has here. The other thing down here, in verse 25, speaking of this horn out of that, he will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the highest one. He will intend to make alteration in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for times and a half time. And so this government here, which I think is depicting a picture of the Roman Empire as it's interacting with the Christians in the New Testament era, trying to persecute them. It talks about he was wear down the saints of the highest one, intend to make alteration in times and law. But remember, one of the primary things that was done in the early Christian era was that the Roman Empire tried to make Christians worship the emperor. And rather than worship God, we're going to worship the emperor. So they're making alteration in the times and the law of what God had set up and trying to make government or man the one that's worshiped. And so that's, again, we see that as something that is mirrored in man's empire. Back this morning, our lesson, Nebuchadnezzar, he set up the idol for people to worship, which represented his power. And here we have the Roman Empire sets up the emperor to be worshiped, which represents their power, their control of people. And so Man's kingdoms, man's empires, as they become dominant, are always going to try to control people through pressing the idea that it is greater than God, and through its laws and through its actions. And we even see some of that in our country, right? We get laws made and enforced against Christian principles. The government will and try to suppress the things of God. I think that's the idea of this. But God's going to sit in judgment, and these things will be taken down. So that has to be our confidence in the face of the opposition. Verse 28. At this point, the revelation ended. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. It was not a happy ending as far as a person living in that day. Here, Daniel has been in and we're going to see this more when we get to chapters, next when we get to chapter 9 in his prayer. Daniel's been living in this captivity now probably 65 years at this point of the writing of chapters 7 and 8. He is remembering the Isaiah prophecy we're going to see in chapter 9. And the Isaiah prophecy was about restoration and peace. And Daniel has just been told there are going to be 4 governments that do not supply restoration and peace before God is going to establish his eternal kingdom. Now, I think that to me explains verse 28. Daniel's in distress because he sees the difficulty that they're under is going to continue for an extended period of time. And again, we're going to see that in chapter 9. And actually, that's the rest of the book. We're going to see that turmoil and oppression by the world government is going to continue. And that's something that's distressing to those who are trying to serve God. Okay, that's kind of my summary there at the end of chapter 7. There are a lot of details in that I have not tried to address. If we could sit down in a small group, we could badger back and forth ideas. I think I have 6 or 7 commentaries on the book of Daniel, and not 2 of them, no 2 of them will give you the same suggestion for the whole chapter. Now, they might cross paths once in a while, but they cross paths and then they diverge. And any of you have studied that, but I think that's generally the idea of chapter 7, is that there are going to be these kingdoms that come before Christ comes. They're going to be oppressive kingdoms, and they're going to try and stop God's kingdom. Now, when we get to chapters 10 and 11, we're going to see that it's not just the kingdoms. There's something from above the horizon that's influencing these kingdoms. And I think that's going to be important for us to see. This is Satan's work. If he can stop God's kingdom from being established, he's won. And I think we're being told here in Daniel, at the time when the children of Israel are in dispersion, it looks like they're a few and no hope of restoration. And it's going to continue in difficulty for an extended period, but God is going to win, but it's going to be through the Son of Man. It's not going to be through the children of Israel. It's going to be through the Son of Man. Okay. Any thoughts there? Eddie?
There's one thing that strikes me, the very last verse, the very last part of the verse, where he said, I kept it to myself. And that's going to be a common theme for the rest of the book.
Right.
In this chapter, in the next chapter, at the end of the book, they will not have anybody share this with.
Okay.
So these very distressing things that he's going through, what do we want to do when we have a bad dream or we have something like that? We want to share it with somebody. Daniel doesn't even have that to do. This is for him.
Okay. And I think the idea that he kept it doesn't mean that he didn't write it down, because we do have it now. But he did not have a compatriot he could sit down with and discuss the implications. And I think that's Eddie's point there. It was something that, a burden that he carried by himself. Okay. Other thoughts? Now we get to chapter 8. I'll just go ahead and jump over here. Chapter 8 is very similar to chapter 7 in the sense that he's going to be seeing, this time in chapter 7, he was apparently in bed asleep when he got his dreams or his visions. In chapter 8, it seems that he might be awake, and he is transported by, we think, by vision to another place in the kingdom to receive this. Chapter 8 is in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king. A vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. Okay, the first one was in the 1st year of Belshazzar's reign. This is in the 3rd year. This is before the 6th chapter when we had, or the 5th chapter when we had the collapse of the kingdom and the handwriting on the wall. It's before all that occurs. So Daniel knows when the handwriting on the wall comes, he knows these things, and he's not surprised that the kingdom's collapsing because he already knows what the next kingdom's going to be from these dreams or these visions he's having. I think that may be part of what's going on with Daniel here, with God and Daniel, is God is letting him know what's coming next, and he's getting ready to go through some very turbulent times. Okay. Since I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam, and I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside Eulalie Canal. A couple of thoughts on that. He has been in all this other visions, and up to this time, everything. He's been where? City of Babylon. That's where he was taken captive. He's been there. Susa. What is the city of Susa? Is the city of Susa significant? Capital of the Persian Empire. So now he's in Babylon, which is the ruling nation. All of a sudden, he's in the Persian capital. You see any indication there that the powers, he sees the power shifting to Persia, because now Susa is going to be the capital in his vision. He sees. I think that's a suggestion to that. And he's by the canal here. This canal is actually a man-made canal between two rivers there in just outside of Susa. And so he sees himself as standing by that canal. So he's there. And I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram had 2 horns, was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, each one was longer than the other, and the longer one coming up last. And I saw the ram budding westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased and magnified himself. So he's there in Susa, and he sees this ram that has 2 horns, and one of the horns is taller than the other one. And that ram, the horns stand for what in these pictures? Sometimes they're kings, but they stand for power. That's the power of an animal. We've got a Highland cow on the farm. And if you don't think her horns are her power, you're badly mistaken. They are her power, and she knows it, and she'll use it. And so there's a ram that's got 2 horns, one of them taller than the other. That suggests that one of the horns is more powerful than the other. And the picture we have seen, there have been 4 kingdoms, and the second kingdom has always been Persia in the picture. I think we're standing by the city of Susa, which is the capital of the Persians. Even at this time, it's the main city of the Persians before Babylon collapses. We've got this ram standing there, these 2 horns. It's not a far-fetched idea, and he's going to tell us down here later in the chapter. This ram is the Persian Empire. And the reason one horn is taller than the other is because it was a Medo-Persian Empire, and the Persians were the dominant group of people in the Medo-Persian Empire. And it's budding north, west, and south. That suggests that it's trying to expand its territory. It's trying to use its power to conquer all things north, west, and south. It doesn't mention east here. What do you suppose that is? It came from the east. It's in the east. Persia is in the east as far as the countries that are being discussed in this biblical narrative. So it's in the east and it's coming to the west, to the north, south, east, and west to conquer everything. And so that's the first picture. And while I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between its eyes. And it came up to the ram that had the two horns, which I had been standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. And he struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. The male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken. In its place there come up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of the heaven. Okay, I'm going to stop there and just look at this. In verse 21 of this chapter, under the interpretation, he talks about the goat, and he calls him a shaggy goat. So you imagine this shaggy goat with one big horn comes across the land, not even touching the ground. What's that suggest to you about this goat? He's coming very quickly. Nothing stops. He doesn't have to go over the mountains. He just comes. He's flying across the land. He tells us in verse 21, this shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. And the two large horns between, the large horn between his eyes is its first king, or its most prominent king. And the broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will rise from his nation, though not with his power. So he tells us this shaggy goat is coming forcefully across the land with this big horn is Greece. Actually, it's the Macedonian Empire who have united the Greek city-states under Philip of Macedon. When he died, Alexander the Great, his son, took over the empire. And if we can think of one of the greatest conquerors of all history, it would be Alexander the Great. As he conquered everything, you think about everything from Greece all the way to India, he conquered in a very short period of time. Was he 33 or 35 when he died? 33. He had conquered this whole territory in just a few short years after he took over for his father, Philip. And so he came very speedily, conquered all these nations, from everything from Greece to India, and everything up north, including all of Asia Minor, all the way down to Egypt. And so he comes conquering everything in his path. And what happened to Alexander the Great? He died, and we think either of dysentery or an infection in Babylon after just very shortly after he had accomplished this great feat. And then his kingdom is split up among four of his generals. Actually, it was split initially among five, but one of them doesn't succeed in controlling his territory. It ends up being split up under four of his generals. Macedonia, the area where Alexander and his father Philip were from, ended up controlling Macedonia and Greece. Cassandra. One of his generals ended up controlling Macedonia and Greece. Thrace and Asia Minor, that's where the cities of Ephesus and all of those cities in the New Testament are. Lysimachus, one of the other generals, ended up controlling that. And those first two, Cassandra and Lysimachus, are of no significance to us in the Old Testament because those nations or generals have no or very limited interaction with the children of Israel. And so they're not significant in the rest of the book of Daniel or many other things in the Old Testament. But there are two of these generals. Seleucus inherits or gets Syria, which contains remnants of the Assyrian Empire, Babylon, and it comes down to the north limits of Judea. And he gets that. And then Ptolemy gets Egypt and everything basically from Israel to the south. So there ends up a dividing line, a very contested dividing line in the middle of Israel between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And we're going to spend much of the Old Testament pushing that line north and pushing that line south. And guess who's going to get the impact of all that turmoil? It's going to be the remnants of the children of Israel that are living in Judea. And so that's going to become significant. And we're going to have some of that in it. I think that's primarily going to be the focus of the 10th, 11th chapters, is that turmoil that God's people are going to have because these two kingdoms are pushing their limits back and forth on each other. So that's kind of he gets this picture. This is what's going to happen. How's it going to be for the children of Israel during this time period? It's going to be turmoil. It's going to be difficult. Yeah, Eddie?
If we might make a parallel with our more modern time, think about the people who lived between Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. during the time of the Civil War.
Okay.
Those lines were pushed back and forth, and those farmers, those people who lived there must have just been thinking, why am I caught in the middle?
Right.
And that's what the people of Israel would have been, they're caught in the middle between these two great powers that are fighting against each other, and they're suffering the consequences.
Okay. And so that's what we're going to see really from the time that the Alexander dies until the Roman Empire stabilizes things a little bit. There's going to be this turmoil there in Israel. Okay. Now that's kind of the picture he's setting up here in chapter 8, is the turmoil and how we get to the Israel and we get to where the turmoil is going to be there because we've got the Seleucids and the Ptolemies that are fighting back and forth. And after all, isn't that what we had early on in the Old Testament with Egypt coming up and Syria coming down? That was the picture through the book of Kings, right? They either, Josiah leaned on Egypt, but Assyria got him, and just things like that. And so it's going to be a continuation of those kinds of struggles. Okay, any other thoughts here? I want to make a few more comments on this last part in chapter 8. We've got a little section up here from verse 9 down through 14, and then he's got some comments on it in 24. So we have the dream, then we have the interpretation. So I'm trying to work those two sections together. Okay, so we have these the division of Alexander's empire into 4 kingdoms, and we have primarily going to focus on the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. It says, out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. So we have out of one of these, and I'm going to submit to you, it's the Seleucids, the Syrian kings. We're going to see the things that suggest that. And so it grows strong to the east, which would be the Syrian area. And it pushes to the south, which is toward Egypt or toward the Ptolemies, and toward the beautiful land. Where would that be? Pardon? Full of milk and honey, right. The land of Canaan. And who's going to be in the beautiful land? God's people. The children of Israel are coming back. And so this, to me, this puts a knot in my stomach if I'm Daniel as soon as I read that. We've got this kingdoms come up, and it's going to try to go through the south, and it's going to come right through the beautiful land. It's what it's going to do. And this is one of these, a little horn that comes up out of that. And it says, it grew up to the hosts of heaven and caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. So the host of heaven, it grew up to the host of heaven. I think since it's a host or a group, it probably signifies a group that is to be devoted to heaven. And who would be the host of heaven in Daniel's day? God's people, the children of Israel. So we've got this Seleucid king who's coming along, and he's going to call some of God's people and some of the stars. The stars are equated many times in the Bible to the leaders amongst the people. That's the stars, the ones that stand out. Causes some of them to fall to the earth, and it's going to trample them down. This king is going to cause some of the Israelites to fall away from God, and they're going to be destroyed, and they're falling away from God. And it's even going to magnify itself to be equal with the commander of the host. Oh, now we've got the host of heaven. The commander of the host of heaven, who might that be? Might be God himself. He's going to remove the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of the transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. A couple of thoughts in that I want to see. It says, because of transgression, the host are the people of God, right? Probably the idea is because of their transgression. That's why they ended up in captivity in Babylon to start with. So now Daniel is seeing that the people are going to get to go back to Israel, but they're not going to be any better in many ways than they were before captivity. And there's going to come another time, there's going to come another king who's just like Nebuchadnezzar. He's going to oppress them. He's going to elevate himself to being above their God, and he's going to trample on them. And so I think that's an idea that we have in this. He's going to eliminate the sacrifice, is going to be stopped. And I heard the Holy One speaking. Another Holy One said to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the division about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgressions cause horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? And he said to me, 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the holy place will be properly restored. So we have a picture that Daniel gets here of one of these Seleucid kings that's going to come. He's going to overrun Judea. He's going to, many of the people are going to fall prey to him. We're going to see later that they're probably people that adopt the Hellenistic ideas and Hellenistic practices rather than the Hebrew practices of the Sabbath and sacrifice and honoring God. They adopt the Greek way of life. And so they fall away from God. And so because of their transgression falling away from God, there's going to come more opposition. Seems to be the point in this section. Now, we can take and do research in history, and we can find an event that fits this to the T, I guess I would say. There was a Greek king in the later, about 187, who was the son of Antiochus III the Great. He actually had several sons. His oldest son, Seleucus IV, was king of Judea had control of the Judean area. And his brother Antiochus was taken. This is when the Roman Empire was starting to exercise its power. And what they would do, they allow Antiochus to govern Judea, but to make sure things went well, they would take one of his sons hostage to Rome. Well, they took Antiochus hostage to Rome to make sure that Antiochus III stayed in line. Well, Antiochus III died, and his oldest son, Seleucus IV, inherits the kingdom. But the problem with being kings is this time, you've always got to watch your back. And if someone assassinated him, Seleucus IV. Well, when Seleucus IV was, before he was assassinated, before he was appointed king, his son, Demetrius, was taken to Rome for a hostage, and Antiochus was released. So at the time that Seleucus IV is assassinated, Antiochus is in Athens, and Seleucus, his son, is in Rome as hostage. Antiochus solicits the help of the Pergamum king and gets back to Antioch there in Syria, which is where the Roman Empire seat is there. And he takes over the kingdom. He usurped the son in hostage in Rome, should have been the king, his nephew. He takes over the kingship and declares himself king of Judea. And he's able to sustain that for a while. But he gets into severe conflict with the Jews. And he begins to oppress the Jews. And some of the Jews at that time had already started adopting the Greek way of living, going to the gymnasium and all of these things, and were abandoning their devotion to God. And so it fits this picture here. Antiochus was making a allegiance. His allegiance with them was pulling them away from God. It was their downfall. But Antiochus formed that, and he became oppressive to the people. He got mad at the people, and he desecrated the temple. He took swine in there and offered it, and the temple was desecrated and not used for about 5.5, 6 years. And so that's an event that fits this. It even fits the 2,300 days in an approximate way that occurred. But what I want us to see, now we might be wrong on it being Antiochus, even though that fits really well. But what we see is Daniel is being told that your people are going to, when they go back, there's going to be other falling aways. And when there are, there's going to be other oppressions, just like the Babylonian oppression. And Daniel has this. I'm going to just finish up here. Verse 27. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up again and carried out the king's business. But I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it to me. He didn't know Antiochus by name. He just knew that there was some turmoil coming, and the people were going to experience this turmoil. Now, This is a picture of what happened in the Persian and Roman times. The picture is so accurate that many people want to tear the 8th chapter out of the book of Daniel and say that it was written after the Maccabean revolt. I didn't even mention the Maccabees. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about those later. You've heard of the Maccabees all your life. The Maccabees are a group of loyal Israelites from amongst the priests who led a revolt against Antiochus's efforts and his desecration of the temple. That seemed to be the final thing that caused them to revolt. He was trying to stamp out the law, stamp out sacrifice anywhere in the land. And a group of priests led that revolt called the Maccabean Rebellion. There's lots of writing and stuff about that. It's all that's interesting history. To me, all of this Greek and the Seleucid and Ptolemies and the Egyptian involvement and Cleopatra and all of that, it's here in the book of Daniel that he talks about that and how that, and I think that's really, to me, it's intriguing how God's people interfaced and were affected by all that. Yes, Eddie.
There's one of the things about Antiochus that I think is very significant here is the name he calls himself is Epiphanes.
Right.
Which is
Thank you
for being the very highest one. And that's unique because he's really the first person who makes himself to be God. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had really kind of tried to bring God down and said, no God is more powerful than I. But he never called himself God. But Antiochus is the first one who actually calls himself God.
Okay.
Now, the Romans were going to do that a lot, as we go further on, but he's the first one that has interaction with God's people that calls himself God. So I think that's a very significant point.
I think it's very significant. I appreciate you saying I had that written down here and I didn't mention that. Thank you, Eddie. Antiochus wasn't his name. He assumed the name Antiochus because that relates to being the ruler, sort of like Pharaoh or something like that. But he also assumed the name Epiphanes. And the meaning of that is God manifest. So here is God before you. Jesus said, have you, told Philip, Philip says, show us the Father. He says, you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Well, Antiochus says, seen me, you've seen God. That's what he said. And so you see, that's why his attitude in desecrating the temple and all these things, probably what drove him is he felt like he was above all. Also, the other thing I didn't mention, he actually was not supposed to be king. I didn't mention that. He usurped his position as king. And then the history I've read on him about his ending, he lost a battle down in Egypt. And history is not real clear as to how he died. There's 2 or 3 accounts I read of how he died. One is that he went off to sea and committed suicide, and he did not die a hero's death at all. And so here he's one who usurped his reign by cunning and conniving, and he elevated himself, assigned himself as God, and then he went out in a non-hero fashion. And so we get to chapter 10, 11, we're going to see a little bit more about Antiochus in that. I did want to see that, to me, the point of chapter 8, the point of chapter 7 was that God is going to establish his kingdom. He told us to know, he didn't mince any words, he told us that. The point of chapter 8 is that the children of Israel are not going to remain faithful. There's going to be turmoil, and it's going to be very much like it was in the days of Egypt, in the days when Babylon came, but there's going to be a faithful remnant who's going to rebel against that. And that's kind of to me. And I can see why Daniel was sick and exhausted for days. Here he's thinking, it's all going to be good. The 70 years is almost over. We're going back to Jerusalem and build Solomon's temple. but we see the devastation that is here. That's from man's perspective. From God's perspective, all is going to be good. The Son of Man is going to come, and the kingdom is going to be based on the Son of Man, not a rule out of Jerusalem. Now, the premillennialists, and I've only mentioned this a couple of times in here, their doctrine's all about man on earth. It's not about the Son of Man and God. It's about man accomplishing things on earth. And very much, maybe like Daniel and those children of Israel were thinking in that day. I think time we get to the end of the book, Daniel's going to have a greater understanding that is not going to be this physical thing. But that's one of the points of that. Okay, I'll finish there tonight. We'll be gone next week. Kevin is going to take chapter 9. I'll just tell you that chapter 9, particularly the first part, the last part gets a little bit difficult. First part is this prayer that Daniel has. This is one of the greatest prayers in the entire Bible. It's just like that confession back in chapter 3. We looked at this one lesson, one of the greatest confessions of faith in the entire Bible. This is one of the greatest prayers in the entire Bible. To me, it ranks real close to the quality of the Lord's Prayer. So study this prayer, what Daniel does in this prayer, and how he appeals to God in that prayer. I think it's really significant for us. So we're going to conclude there. And thank you for your patience with me tonight.